Now, we're going to move now and begin to actually talk about Joseph. But the reason we spent so much time discussing these things is because it would be one thing for me to jump into the story of Joseph and start sharing what all these types and shadows are. But I believe that if we understand these concepts, that these concepts about concealed and things being revealed, about how things are to be understood cyclically, etc., if we understand those concepts are not just for the story of Joseph, but for the entirety of the Bible, then from now on, when you go and study the Scripture, perhaps these things will be in the back of your mind. You'll want to be, trying to understand what the Scripture is telling us with these concepts in mind. Now, what I want to do at this point, since we're still kind of talking about cycles, but we're going to kind of segue into the story of Joseph, is to go to Psalm 81, and we're going to read the first 4 or 5 verses of Psalm 81, and it begins this way. Sing aloud to God our strength. Make a joyful shout to the God of Jacob. Raise a song and strike the timbrel, the pleasant harp with the lute. Blow the trumpet, or blow the horn, at the time of the new moon, and that word is chodesh, at the full moon on our solemn feast day. Now I want to pause there. First of all, this psalm is it's not a funeral dirge. This is a kind of a happy occurrence. They're blowing trumpets and striking the timbrels and the harps and things of this nature. So it's a very joyful time. But then in verse 3, we're told to blow the trumpet, blow the horn at the time of the new moon, and then at the full moon on our solemn feast day. So I want to kind of break this down a little bit. First of all, the horn, most people are familiar with the shofar, the ram's horn, the biblical trumpet. Typically, a trumpet or a shofar is blown for one purpose, and that is to draw your attention to something, whether it be one of the Moedim, whether it be the new moon, whether it be assembly for war or prayer, what have you. The shofar is blown to get your attention. Now, this particular shofar in Psalm 81 is being blown on the new moon, and then again, apparently, on the full moon on our solemn feast day. Now, that it's a solemn feast day, the Hebrew word is Hag there, and a solemn feast day, there's only 3 that are determined to be a Hagim. And that is the 3 pilgrimage festivals, which is Passover and Pentecost, and then again at the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, of those 3, only 2 of them occur during a full moon. That's the Passover, and then that's the Feast of Tabernacles. But to kind of specify this a bit more, the time frame that he's talking about here, he says not only to blow it at the full moon, but also a new moon. Now, there is only one of the Moedim, or appointed times, or the feast days, if you will, that you blow a shofar on a new moon. There's only one of the feast days that actually occurs on a new moon, and that particular feast day is called Yom Teruah, or a lot of people know it as Rosh Hashanah. This is what begins the civil year, or the civil calendar. This is the biblical Feast of Trumpets, or the blowing of the shofar. And so here's my point. It seems to me that if you take all this into consideration, Psalm 81 actually is specifying which of these feasts to blow the trumpet on. It's at a new moon, and again, there's only one Moedim that occurs on a new moon. That's Yom Teruah, or the Feast of Trumpets. And then blow it again on a full moon. It so happens that the full moon that follows Yom Teruah, or the Feast of Trumpets, which occurs at the new moon again, is the Feast of Tabernacles, one of the 3 pilgrimages that you make to Jerusalem. Here is my point. Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, are at the end of the biblical feast cycle. In other words, a trumpet is blown to call your attention to some things that are happening at the end of the cycle. That's the point. I'm going to suggest to you that is hinting that those who are living at the end of the cycle, or let me put it this way, at the end of the days, pay attention. A shofar is being blown. And what is it going to call our attention to? Look at the moon. First the new moon, and then the full moon. Now, let's talk about the lunar cycle for just a moment. And again, I know you're thinking, what has this got to do with Joseph? Well, I'm about to show you. First of all, we have a new moon. And what does that mean? Well, first of all, we have to understand that there is an astronomical new moon, and then there is the biblical new moon. And the difference is this. The astronomical new moon is when the moon is in conjunction. In other words, it has moved, the moon has moved, which revolves around the earth, by the way. The moon has moved between the earth and the sun. Now, because the moon does not rotate on its axis, the same face is the same side of the moon is always facing the earth, and the same side of the moon is always facing the sun. So when the moon moves between the earth and the sun, the overpowering light of the sun hides the moon. This is when it is in conjunction. This is when it disappears and when we can't see it at night. You know, we walk outside and the moon is concealed. It's very, very dark. Now that's the astronomical new moon. However, the biblical new moon is when, after the moon has come into this point of conjunction where it's hidden, it's concealed, when it moves out of this time between the earth and the sun, then that's when we can begin to see it again. So in other words, the biblical new moon is when, after the moon has disappeared, after it's been hidden, when it reappears, when it resurrects, if you will, when we first see that sliver of light in the night sky, when that happens, that is the biblical new moon. And you blow a shofar to call attention to this. In fact, this is how the Hebrew calendar is determined, at the appearance of the new moon. My point is this. We want to pay attention to this. The moon is a body that is unable to generate its own light. It merely reflects the light of the sun. So, it disappears. As it goes through its phases, it disappears. We can't see it. Typically, it will reappear, or it will resurrect, if you will, on the third day. It's been hidden for 2 days, but on the third day, we see that first little sliver of light. And again, what are we seeing? We're seeing not the light of the moon, but we're seeing the light of the sun reflected off the face of the moon. And then that light goes back down to the earth. Now, as the moon moves through this cycle day by day, more and more of the surface of the moon is going to be seen as it reflects the light of the sun. It's as if it were the moon was turning its face more directly into the sun. And so as it continues through this cycle, we come to, 2 weeks later, we come to what is called a full moon. And this is the time when the moon is reflecting the light of the sun at maximum capacity. This is when you can walk outside without the aid of a flashlight or a lantern, and you can maneuver in the dark because the light of the sun is being reflected off the face of the moon so brilliantly that it's light outside. You can see. Now, we're also told in Psalm 81 to blow the shofar at this time. Call attention to this. Now, when the moon is new and when the moon is full, this is when it has the most direct impact on something that's down here on earth. And that is the tides, or shall I say the seas. The moon has impact or impacts the seas at the new moon and at the full moon at the greatest levels. And the seas, most of you understand in the Scripture that the seas are used to personify nations, the peoples of the earth. And so what are we learning from this? Is that this heavenly body called the moon, as it begins to reflect the light of the sun, it begins to impact the nations. And if you could imagine the seas, that is the nations, the tides coming up onto the surface of the earth. When the tides are high, that's when most of the earth is concealed by the waters. But when the tides move out, that's when some of the earth that was once concealed is now revealed because the tides have moved out. And so the tides teach us of what? When you go to the ocean and you look out and see the water, you don't see anything but water. You see the white caps, you see the surface of the ocean. But we all know that there's a world that exists beneath the surface of those waves. As a matter of fact, that's where a lot of fish live. The moon impacts those seas. The light of the sun reflecting off the moon is what impacts those tides. In other words, the nations where the fish are. So what I'm saying here is that you and I, the body, if you will, is to reflect the light of the sun. We can't generate our own light. We can only reflect His light. But when we do reflect His light, as this light grows greater and greater, as, like I said, as we turn our face, if you will, more directly into the face of the sun, we reflect His glory and His light, then this has the greatest impact upon the nations. And this is the place and the point where things that had once been concealed are now going to be revealed. When the moon reflects the light of the sun, it's going to impact the seas. When we reflect the light of the sun, it's going to impact the nations. Things that had been kept hidden are now going to be revealed. Things that have been kept concealed are now going to be revealed. When does this process begin? Typically, after that moon has been hidden, after it disappears, after it's been concealed, it will reappear, or it will resurrect, if you will, on the third day. And that's a very, very important point to remember as we go through this teaching. Now, we're going to go back to Psalm 81. We're going to look at the next two verses here. Verse 4, everything we just described, he says in verse 4, "This is a statute for Israel and a law of the God of Jacob. And this He established in Joseph as a testimony when he went throughout the land of Egypt, where I heard a language I did not understand." In other words, everything we just discussed about things hidden and then being revealed, when are they revealed? Typically on the third day. Things being concealed, then being revealed, impacting the nations. All these ideas, and calling attention to this at the end of the cycle by blowing the shofar, calling people's attention to this. It is established in Joseph, the Scripture says. So then we have to ask this question. What do things concealed and then being revealed, what do secrets that God has kept hidden until such a time as this, as it were, what does all this have to do with Joseph? Well, to understand that, we're going to have to go back and look at Joseph's story. And what I want to do is I want to show you something real quick here. And some of you will be familiar with this, some of you will not. But this is called the Chumash, which is just a Hebrew word that means five, or the 5 books. And of course it's referring to the 5 books of Moses, or the Torah. Some people call it the law. But in the Torah, or in the Chumash, every year, beginning at Simchat Torah, when the scroll is rolled back from the end to the beginning, we begin to read the Chumash, or we begin to read the Torah in different portions, because the 5 books of Moses are divided up into parsha, or different portions. And every year we will read these portions, and then when we get to the end, we'll go back to the beginning and we'll start again. One of the benefits of this is that every week, all Jewish people, whether they be Messianic or Orthodox, and a lot of people like myself who aren't Jewish, but nevertheless read the Torah portions, we'll be reading the same portions of Scripture every week. And there's a lot of benefit to this, but here's what I want to get to. As we go through this cycle of reading the Torah year after year, here's what I've discovered personally. That every year I read a particular portion, there's something this year I see that I didn't see the year before. And I will presume that next year when I read it, I'll see something yet again that I didn't see this year. Why? Because things are to be understood as moving in cycles. God teaches, God reveals, God illuminates cyclically. Every time we go around that cycle, by His Spirit, He's going to show us something that we didn't see before.